So let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Schrein, and then we'll start with the talk. So Dr. Mark Schrein balances a world-class surgical career with a deep commitment to helping others navigate their own high-stakes transitions. As editor-in-chief of BMJ Global Health and a Columbia-trained surgeon, Mark brings more than just clinical experience to his coaching practice. He also holds a PhD in the science of decision making. He works specifically with professionals and executives facing burnout or major life shifts, offering a grounded, evidence-based perspective on how to make consequential choices with clarity and purpose. You can learn more about his work at markschrein.com. And with that, Dr. Schrein, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak with you all today, and to Tony for the invitation. So, as Tony said, my clinical training is as a head and neck surgical oncologist and reconstructive surgeon, which I still practice 12 weeks out of my year, not in the US. I practice on hospital ships that are docked off the coast of some of the world's poorest countries. I do that with an organization called Mercy Ships, which is a huge portion of my story. So you'll see the name Mercy Ships come up a couple of times in my own stories, or a couple of times in this talk, but they're not the focus of this talk. I also, as Tony said, I'm the editor-in-chief of BMJ Global Health, which is also not the focus of this talk. What I do spend a lot of my time doing is working with folks, especially medical folks, who hit what feels like that kind of inevitable burnout that we get at some point in our careers. And, we'll look back at their careers and say, medicine was great to me, or research was great to me for the first 10 or 15 years, but I cannot see myself doing the same thing for the next 10 or 15 years. But I also don't know what I want to do. Like, I don't even know how to make these big consequential decisions for the next part of my life. And as Tony said, my PhD is in the science of decision making. So I work with them using this science-based approach to making decisions. Two other disclosures. I do get some research consulting funding from Global Surgery Advisors, and I am in clinical leadership for Mercy Ships, which comes with a very small stipend. Okay, with all that housekeeping, let's talk about burnout. Burnout is incredibly common in the healthcare professions, and especially in academic medicine. Something that you all know intellectually, and probably some of you know existentially as well. There was a paper that came out out of Italy in 2020 after the first wave of the pandemic that showed that burnout was particularly highlighted at the early part of this pandemic that we're living in. 1 in 5 health professionals at that point showed clinical signs of depression. And to a degree that has not happened really before or since, physicians voted with their feet. 117,000 physicians left the workforce in 2021 alone. To put that in perspective, that is 4.5 years of graduating medical school classes leaving the practice in just a single year. And it wasn't just physicians, nurses did the same. 300,000 nurses left nursing in the first 2 years of the pandemic. The pandemic really highlighted the problem of burnout in our professions, but it didn't create the problem of burnout in our professions. And a lot of people left, and I am one of those people. So before I get to the research and the decision frameworks and everything that I want to present today, I want to tell you a little bit about my story to kind of put all that stuff into context. The way I say it, my story began with a car accident. And if you can help it, try not to get into a car accident in Liberia, because it does kind of shift your entire career. This happened in 2008. So I had finished, for background, I had finished university, medical school, residency, and my first of 2 fellowships, and had burnt myself out twice in that process. And so at the end of my first fellowship, in the middle of 2007, I took a year off. And I spent the first 6 months of that year just traveling. And then the second 6 months of that year working as a head and neck surgeon on a hospital ship with Mercy Ships docked off the coast of Monrovia, which is the capital of Liberia. And this particular weekend in 2008, about 20 of us wanted to go from Monrovia to a beach town a few hours to the northwest called Robertsport. Now, the drive from Monrovia to Robertsport takes a few hours, but is pretty simple. But an hour north of Monrovia at a town called Clay, you turn left. The road, at least in 2008, from Monrovia to Clay was paved, but the road west from Clay to Robertsport was then in 2008 a single track red dirt road. It was pretty flat, pretty well maintained in the dry seasons, but it was punctuated by these rickety wooden bridges that crossed ravines. And so 20 of us hired five taxis. Now, I use the word taxi a little bit generously here. This is 2008. This is 4 years after two back-to-back civil wars have ravaged the country. So the infrastructure in Liberia had not really recovered. So these taxis were bright yellow, as you saw, but they didn't necessarily even have contiguous floorboards. Like you could sometimes see the road underneath your feet. And they were driven by kids. The guy that drove my taxi could not have been more than about 18 years old. The deal with young men in cars is that we like to go fast. So the minute we made that left-hand turn at Clay, they took off. And those of us in the back, those of us passengers, were absolutely loving it. It was a weekend away from the big city, a weekend away from work. We were headed to the beach. The wind was in most people's hair. So we urged our drivers on. And the driver of the car that I was in was the fastest. So he made his way to the front of the pack. And what he would do is on the straight parts of the road, he would go as fast as he could to stay ahead of that pack. And then he knew where the bridges were. He'd stop, he'd slow down, he'd take each bridge responsibly, and he'd book it again to the next bridge. You can kind of see what I'm building up to here. If you drive down a dirt road really fast and then you slow down all of a sudden, you kick up a whole bunch of dust behind you. The car behind us didn't see us, smashed right into us. We fell off the bridge and into the ravine. Now, they say that time slows down, and it's true. It does. 18 years later, I still remember the ground coming to meet the windshield. And I remember very clearly thinking, oh, this is how I die. I'm okay with that. The ground hit the windshield. The car was totaled. Thankfully, none of us was totaled. We escaped with a bunch of scrapes and bruises and a whole lot of whiplash. And it was a passing contingent of the UN peacekeeping forces that was there. They saw what happened. They got us out of the ravine, made sure we were okay, packed us into the other four taxis. We made it to Robertsport for the weekend, had a great weekend there, and then made it back to Monrovia for work on the hospital ship on Monday morning. There's been a lot of research into this time dilation that happens in catastrophic and near-death experiences. Arstila from Finland thinks that this time dilation is due to an immediate upramping of the normal cognitive processes that are happening in our brains every day. That upramping itself may be due to the release of one of 14 different neurotransmitters that are released in the brains, at least of rats, right before we execute them. But there's a second school of thought. Stetson and his colleagues in 2006 did this absolutely fascinating experiment where they basically pushed people off a 150-foot tower into a net, trying to recreate this time dilation, and they found that they couldn't. So they theorized that this time dilation was due to an ex post facto misremembering of the events of that catastrophic or near-death experience. Super fascinating stuff. Like I dove so deep into this after that happened to me to try to understand what was going on. And gradually, as I was reading about it, I realized that it's super fascinating, but on some level was a bit tangential, because that thought, this is how I die and I'm okay with it, that thought stuck with me for the weekend in Robertsport and has continued to stick with me for the 18 years since. And I realize now that although I'd burnt myself out twice before that accident in Robertsport, I was okay with it because by then I had started to restructure my life in accordance with my why. Now, my road to getting there was not straight. Unlike many people, as I'll show you in the research in just a second, I never wanted to be a doctor, like actively, adamantly resisted becoming a doctor. I wanted to be a rock star because what little boy doesn't want to be a rock star? Or I wanted to be a philosopher because also what little boy doesn't want to be a philosopher? But I grew up in a religious family and I was very religious, especially in my teenage years. And so I read and admired the stories of missionaries, of people like Bruce Olson, Hudson Taylor, and Jim Elliot. So what I really wanted to be was a linguist. I had a very specific dream when I was a teenager. I had a very specific dream that I would disappear into the jungles of Papua New Guinea. I would create the writing system for a language that had not been written yet. I would translate the Bible and Shakespeare into that language. And I realized in 2026 how problematic that statement is. And then I would come out 30 years later after my work was done. But I'm also the firstborn son of an immigrant family. And as any children of immigrants in this room know, sometimes it feels like we only have three choices: doctor, lawyer, or failure. So I chose medicine. And I hated it. I'm not going to belabor how much I hated my training, except to tell you two stories. The first is the very first time that I burnt out was after my first month of medical school. I remember after my first month of medical school being in my dean's office, being in the chair in her office, asking her if I could quit. And she told me to stick it out, to hold on for a little bit because it does get better than what I was experiencing. And instead of quitting, she told me I should take a year off and see how I felt. So I did. I moved from Texas, where I was in medical school, to Singapore to put 9,700 miles between me and medicine. Excuse me. I was a teacher in Singapore. I absolutely loved that year. I loved my year teaching, so much so that at the end of it, I walked myself to the immigration building in Singapore, fully intending to figure out what it would take to apply for permanent residency in that country to keep 9,700 miles between me and medicine. I'm not a brave man. I walked up to that building. I kid you not, put my hand on the door and then chickened out, turned around, went back home, went back to med school, residency, hated every minute of it. The other thing I want to tell you about that, though, is that line that my dean used is a line I heard over and over again that I should stick it out. It gets better. It gets better. It gets better. And on some level, that's correct. It does get better. Being an attending is way better than being a resident. But I finished all of my training. I came back from Liberia, finished my second fellowship, got my first real attending job as a head and neck surgeon at one of the big city hospitals in Boston. And I'd finally achieved the thing that I'd been working towards for my entire life. I'd gotten to better. And I looked around and I was like, this is not what I signed up for. And that story is incredibly common in so many of my clients and so many folks in medicine in general, that we work so hard to get to a thing that we've been trying to achieve. And then we get to that thing and it's not what we signed up for. And then we're not really sure what to do with that. And that is what I want to talk about for the next half hour here. I want to discuss why it is that we get burnt out. And here, for the non-physicians in the room, I am going to focus a bit on physicians and data around physicians. Fundamentally, what causes burnout is pretty similar, irrespective of whether it is medicine that you're working in. So why are we burnt out? 3 reasons for that. And then at the end of the talk, I want to give a 50,000-foot view of one of the decision science frameworks that I use with my clients to help them navigate out of the stuckness of burnout. Now, I say 50,000-foot view because we only have an hour together. I do want to leave some time at the end for questions. So I'm not going to be able to dive really deeply into this decision framework. I'm happy to answer questions about the decision framework either in the Q&A session or afterwards. Okay, so let's dig in to what it is, especially around medicine, that burns people out. And I want to introduce you to a client of mine named Margaret. Now, this is not her real name. I've changed her name. I've changed some identifying details. But Margaret's story is that she, unlike me, always knew that she wanted to be a doctor. Like since the age of 6, she'd been telling people that she wanted to be a doctor. Her parents were both doctors. She had a great relationship. She almost idolized her mother. She did not like her father at all, but both of them gave her narratives as she was growing up that very much lionized the profession of medicine. So she, at the age of 12, was able to articulate that what she wanted for her life was to be the person that people could call when there was an emergency. She wanted the feeling that when she walked into a patient's room, people's shoulders would fall, and they would feel like, okay, we're good. Margaret is here. And she pursued that identity with single-minded devotion through college, through med school, through residency, through an ICU fellowship, and then working as an ICU physician. And then COVID hit. And like so many of us, she burnt out in COVID. But because this had been her identity since she was 6, because she also felt like her patients really needed her, and she was a very good ICU physician, the only thing she knew how to do was keep her head down, show up in the ICU day in and day out, despite that burnout, which had negative externalities on the rest of her life as well. For example, her marriage ended in 2021 in the second year of the pandemic. There are a lot of strands happening in Margaret's story that I want to unpick here. The first is something called career inheritance. It's not just a trope that kids follow in their parents' footsteps. They really do. 50%, depending on the domain, 50% of children will follow in their parents' career footsteps. There's this fascinating article, for example, looking at the odds ratio of a self-employed person having self-employed parents, and it was about 2 to 1. And these odds increase for the career of the parent of the same gender as opposed to the careers of parents of other genders. So one thing happening in Margaret's case, and for about 50% of us in the room, is that we're following in the footsteps of our parents. But even if you're not, a good number of doctors know that they want to be doctors very early in their lives. 73% of doctors knew before they reached the age of 20 that they wanted to be physicians. And nearly a third of them knew it, like Margaret did, before they were even teenagers. Think about that for a second. Like before our prefrontal cortex is a glimmer in our midbrain's eye, we're already saying to ourselves and to the world that we want to be doctors. And even if you're in the 27% who didn't know that, didn't say that, the way that our medical training is structured, we have to choose our specialties in our mid 20s, make a decision in our mid 20s that's supposed to carry us on all the way to retirement. The decision that we make in our mid 20s that we're not really allowed to change, which I'll get to in just a second. So that's one thing that's going on. The other thing that's going on is what it takes to become an expert, whether you're an expert physician, expert researcher. Here, I want to introduce you to the science or the research of Erickson and Poole, who study expertise, what it takes to become an expert, and what expertise does to us and the way that we think as well. And in becoming an expert, Erickson and Poole identify three different types of practice. The first they call naive practice. Naive practice is rote practice. It's practice that is geared towards speed, towards familiarity, towards muscle memory. The example I give for this is surgical knot time. If you've gone through medical school, you know that on your surgery rotations, you were given a packet or two of 2-0 silk ties and basically told to tie as many knots as you can on any vertical surface in your apartment. Don't let the word naive here fool you. It's not a bad thing. Naive practice is super important. Like as a surgeon, it's very important for me to know how to tie knots quickly and with muscle memory. But that's only one level of practice. That in and of itself doesn't get you to expertise. The next level of practice that they identify, they call purposeful practice. This has two distinct characteristics. It is repetition, it is naive practice, but it's coupled with a bit of a meta evaluation. It's practice and then figuring out how good your practice is. And then it has this effect of broadening your comfort zone. The skills that you master at one level become the baseline for the skills that you're going to practice at the next level. This doesn't happen in naive practice. There's basically only 4 ways, for example, to tie a surgical knot. So it's not as if once I've learned how to do a one-handed and a two-handed tie, somebody then says, okay, now you've graduated to the 5-handed and the 6-handed tie. That does happen in purposeful practice. But even that is not enough to get to expertise. The last level of practice that they identify is something that they call deliberative practice. This is practice that is full commitment. This is all in practice. This often involves apprenticeship style training, which those of us who are doctors all had to go through in our residencies and our fellowships. This is the practice that makes the shoe repair person into a cobbler. And this is the type of practice that makes the medical student into a doctor. And each level of this practice ladder requires increasing emotional investment. So you've got identity already created, but then you've got a lot of emotional investment into this identity as you become an expert, which in and of itself changes the way that you think. Experts, especially experts in complex fields like science, like the human body, like medicine, have to, in Erickson and Poole's words, have to build detailed mental representations of their domains. We don't and cannot necessarily remember and keep at the front of our minds all the time every single step of the Krebs cycle. We have to contextualize the Krebs cycle within a representation of the domain of medicine in our specialty. And we build these mental representations so that we can make appropriate decisions, so that we can explain this complexity to our patients who don't have the same mental representations in their minds, and also just for us to understand how everything fits together, and importantly, how we fit in the middle of all that. So developing expertise doesn't just change what we do or how fast we do it, but it changes how we think about our domains and how we think about us in relation to our domains. So there are a number of fields, which I call identity professions. So medicine, you're not just working as a doctor, you're working in medicine, you are a doctor. You're not just working in the law, you are a lawyer. You're not just working at the church, you are a pastor, you are a priest. There are some professions in which what we do becomes our identity, and medicine is very much one of those professions. These numbers here are, in my mind, a little bit crazy. They're hard to look at. They're very recent, 2024. Only 12% of physicians would actually recommend a career in medicine to somebody coming out of college right now. 9 in 10 physicians would not recommend that somebody else goes into the practice of medicine. but 32% would choose the career again themselves. Crazy numbers. To me, the most interesting part of these two numbers is that the second number is 3 times higher than the first. Tells us very much how much medicine becomes an identity for us, that even though we wouldn't tell other people to do it, we would pick it again for ourselves. That is the longest of the three-legged stool that creates burnout. The second thing I want to talk about is what happens over the course of our adult life. There's a book that I recommend to basically every single one of my clients. It's by Richard Rohr. It's called Falling Upward. Now, Richard Rohr is a Catholic priest. There are chapters in this book that are very Catholic, so I recommend it with that particular caveat. But Rohr has this thesis in his book that there are two halves of adult life. In the first half of adult life, we are achievement focused. We're building our ego structures through achievement. Now, what we're pursuing, what sort of achievement we're pursuing varies. We might be trying to achieve more money, more recognition, more fame, more impact in the world, more help for people, but we are trying to achieve something in the first half of our lives. And then this just inchoate shift happens in us in the second half of our lives, where we shift from that ego structure building, achievement focused approach to our lives to what he calls the village elder part of our lives. And Rohr's supported by a whole bunch of research. Now, I want to present to you here a different Erikson. This is Erik Erikson's framework from 70 years ago. Those of you who do psychosocial development as a profession will know that there's research to support Erikson's framework and also research to contradict Erikson's framework. I'm not presenting it to you because I think it's in any way true with a capital T, but it's a really useful way of thinking about what happens in our lives. Erikson theorized that there are 8 stages of psychosocial development from infancy all the way to death. And at each stage, there is a key tension that has to be managed. And if you manage that tension well, then it becomes easier to manage subsequent tensions, which themselves get increasingly complex. So for example, in infancy, the tension that we have to manage is trust versus mistrust. Do we believe, now obviously we manage this one subconsciously, but do we believe that our universe, our caregivers, have our best interests at heart? And if we resolve that tension towards trust, then it becomes a lot easier to navigate the next tension of autonomy versus shame and doubt. Whereas if we resolve that tension towards mistrust, then boy, is it much harder to navigate a tension between autonomy and shame and doubt. Fast forward then to late adulthood. The tension that we have to manage in late adulthood is something he calls generativity versus stagnation. So we've made that inchoate shift from building ego structures through achievement to that sort of village elder portion of our lives. We then have a tension of, do we want to continue the things that we were doing that built our ego structures in the first half of our lives, even though we've shifted? That leads to stagnation, that leads to feelings of stuckness. Or do we want to shift what we're doing to align with what's happened internally and continue generativity? So leg number 1 of the burnout stool, medicine is an identity. Leg number 2, we change over the course of our careers, over the course of our lives. Just internally, tensions that we have to manage change. And the things that we valued at 26, some of them may no longer be things that we value at 46. Our values themselves shift, which leads to the third stool and this idea of a protean career. We change as adults, all of us do, but physicians in particular, we don't leave. We don't change what we do. We don't leave medicine at all, except unless it was 2021 and the pandemic. We don't, unless something else happens, necessarily decrease our patient load. Maybe we give up call by the time we're in our late 50s or early 60s, but we don't fundamentally change what we do. Now, that's for many reasons. It's for fear of identity loss. It is for concern for our patients, like Margaret had. It's because we've had so much investment into this career that we don't necessarily have a lot of interest built up outside of medicine. And for that reason, physicians are famous for delaying retirement. And also because the medical system that we work in here in the US kind of guilt trips us into staying. As I was researching this talk, I came across this essay by Gordon Dickey entitled, "Should Older Family Physicians Retire?" And Dickey's response was no, that we should not retire. He writes here are a few reasons that I think older physicians should not retire. This brings me to the research of Douglas Hall and the life course of careers. Hall proposed this also 50 years ago, and he's updated it a few times, most recently in 2018. Fundamentally, Hall sees two different types of careers over the life course. One he calls traditional, and one he calls protean, named after the Greek god Proteus, who was famously a shapeshifter. The traditional career is the career that we tend to associate with perhaps boomers and the generations before them. This is the stereotypical career of somebody who comes out of grad school, starts at IBM, and then graduates from IBM. That your entire career is spent sort of rising through the ranks of a big company. If you think about it, the entity in charge of that career is not the person, it's the organization, it's IBM. And the things that a traditional career reward are commitment to that organization. They are longevity within that field, they are advancement within that field, therefore mobility is lower, and the criteria for success are position and salary. Most of the American conversation around careers has shifted away from traditional careers to what Hall called the protean career. The protean career is what we think about for careers in, say, millennials or Gen Z or younger, that the careers of these folks are or will be a career that's driven by the person themselves. That the key values in that career course, freedom, growth, work satisfaction, if you hit a wall at a place, then you just move on to the other place, a higher degree of mobility. Success criteria probably should be psychological success, although obviously position level and salary are that as well. Most of the American conversation has moved towards the protean career. Let me give you an example. For 3 years, up until the end of 2024, I was the chief medical officer of Mercy Ships, of this organization that I've mentioned a few times. And in that C-suite level, I interacted with other folks in the C-suite, including the chief operating officer, who became a friend of mine. Robert started his career at Nokia in mobile phones. And then he rose up in Nokia for a bit, and then he moved from Nokia to Southwest Airlines, where he worked for a little bit longer, rose up in those ranks, and then moved over to Mercy Ships. And at the age of, I think, 46, had become the COO of Mercy Ships. And nobody would look at Robert's career. Nobody would look at Robert's CV and say, oh man, you're a flight risk. Like, look at you. You went from mobile phones to airlines to hospital ships. And yet I guarantee that if you're trying to hire a surgeon into your practice and you see that every 5 years she has changed from one domain to another, you would look at her and say, oh, yeah, no, that's a flight risk. And that's because medicine still hasn't made that shift from a traditional career that values stability and lower mobility towards a protean career. So we've got medicine as an identity. We change, our values shift over the course of our lives, but we are assumed that we're going to get on that moving sidewalk of medicine once we go into medical school, once we choose our specialty, and then basically stay on that moving sidewalk until we retire well past the normal retirement age. And in fact, the structure of how we practice medicine has not adapted to anything other than that. This is an absolutely brilliant editorial by Danielle Offrey that came out just before the pandemic started, in mid-2019, in which she makes the point that the very business of healthcare is predicated on folks doing what Margaret did during the pandemic, which is just keeping their heads down and continuing, day in and day out, despite the burnout, despite the high personal cost. She writes here, most physicians remain committed to the ethics that brought them into the field in the first place. An overwhelming majority of doctors and nurses do the right thing for their patients, even at high personal cost. This is what burnout is. And this is the reason that the usual responses, the usual solutions for burnout don't actually work. Wellness programs, resiliency programs. Listen, I meditate, I practice yoga, but yoga programs, meditation programs, deep breathing, the research after research, paper after paper shows very little and very limited effects of these programs. This is one particular paper out of Texas that did show an improvement in physician-reported wellness after their wellness program, but that improvement was not statistically significant. And in fact, in another review of these studies, the majority of wellness programs for physicians do not show a statistically significant benefit. And that's because fundamentally, burnout is not a wellness problem. Burnout is not a resiliency problem. Burnout is not you're not breathing deeply enough or doing enough yoga problem. Fundamentally, the problem is that you can't yoga your way out of a system that's built on the assumption that you're just going to stay and never change. This is the three-legged stool that leads to us burning out in our careers. It's our identity, We change. There's a mismatch between who we are today and who we were back at 26. And our system assumes that that mismatch just doesn't matter. We must continue with our heads down, showing up day in and day out. The other problem that we face is that we've never really been given a good framework to make tough career decisions that burnout requires. Big career decisions impact on all sorts of domains, all sorts of levels. They impact on our why. What is it that we're trying to accomplish now that we are 46 and not 26? Has that why changed over the course of our lives? What are our options? Who are we? What's our identity? Who are the other stakeholders in this position? If we're going to make a change, when are we going to make it? When's the right time to make it? How do we deal with the finances? And what if we're wrong? What if we make a change and all of a sudden we regret that change? We are entrusted to make pretty significant decisions, life-altering decisions for our patients. But really, nobody gives us good frameworks to make these sorts of decisions for ourselves. The best advice that we're ever given is talk to trusted advisors and maybe make a pro-con list. And those are not necessarily up to the task of making these hard career decisions. So that's what I want to do for the last 10 minutes or so that we're together, and then open it up for about 15 minutes of questions, is build a framework that'll do this. Now, as I said, I'm going to say the 50,000-foot view. And at 50,000 feet, I'm not going to be able to address every single thing on this slide. The framework that I'm going to present to you all here will focus on the first two. What is it that we're trying to actually accomplish at the midpoint of our careers? And then what are our options? And which of those options is most likely to achieve that why that we're trying to accomplish? So we're going to actually work through a worked example of this. I want to introduce you to a different client named Aya. Aya was a physician, or is a physician. When she saw me, she was 48 years old, deeply burnt out, like really at rock bottom here. She was in that position that so many doctors do get to. They're like, I just cannot do this anymore. Like I cannot imagine myself being full-time, seeing patients every single day for the next 30 years of my life. On the other hand, she does love medicine, and she does love her patients. She's not sure she wants to leave medicine altogether. As Tony said in the introduction, she's kind of viewed this as a binary yes or no, stay or go. She's not sure she wants to do either of them. So how does she decide what she wants to do next? One more wrinkle, which will become important as we build up this framework. She currently lives in Omaha. She loves big cities, and she has always said since she was a kid that she wants to live in order, either San Francisco, New York City, or LA. And she's thinking, look, at this point, as I'm considering a change, maybe this is the right time to try my hand out at one of these cities as well. Before she had gotten to me, Aya had been looking for jobs and actually had secured 3 different job offers. One was a clinical job in New York City, one of the cities she's been dying to live in, but it was part-time. Job number 2 was clinical only in that she would be working for a startup that was doing clinical things, but she would not be seeing patients. She would be the chief medical officer of this clinical startup in Tulsa. Job number 3 was a full-time clinical role at a different hospital in Omaha, different from the one that had burnt her out already. So the first thing that we did together is actually go to the usual decision-making framework that we are told to use, which is to set up a pro-con list. So let's actually do that together here for the first 2 of Aya's job options. Part-time clinical job in New York City is job number 1. So pro on the left, con on the right. It was pretty easy for Aya to put New York City in the pro column. This is someplace that she's always wanted to live. She initially put clinical work in the cons column because she was so burnt out, but also, as I said, she wasn't really sure she wanted to give that up yet. Part-time may be better than full-time, so she moved clinical over here to the middle, and then the salary was definitely a con of this job. It's part-time. New York City is very expensive. She did the same thing for job number 2. Job number 2, she moved salary to the pro because this startup had actually gone through 2 rounds of funding. There was definite salary for her. She wasn't sure how she would feel about doing admin work as her day-to-day. And no offense to anybody here who's from Tulsa, but she really did not want to live in Tulsa. This is her pro-con list. And some of her advisors within medicine were saying, no, you should stay. Some of her advisors outside of medicine were like, you're so burnt out, you should leave. This is how she's supposed to make a decision. And with this information and her advisor's advice, there's literally no way to make a good decision between these 2 jobs. So let's actually go through a process where we make this pro-con list a little bit more granular, a little bit more objective, and actually come out with a decision for Aya. I'm going to go through steps of building up this framework. I'm going to give you the results of the exercises that Aya and I did to get to these steps. So we're not going to go into the exercises themselves. I'm just going to tell you what the outcomes were so I can go through all of these steps. Step number one that I ask my clients is, what are the 3 to 5 most important things that you are trying to solve for in this decision? When you are changing careers or thinking of leaving medicine or whatever it is, what are you actually trying to solve for? And for Aya, there were 3. Her big 3 most important things to her were which city she lived in, how much salary she made. She had kids. She wanted to send her kids to college, and she didn't want to be busting her butt to make that salary. These were the 3 most important things to her. Everything else was secondary. This is what she wanted this decision to solve for. Question number 2 is, how do you rank these? Which is actually most important? Is she willing to trade a lower salary to be in a better city, or is she willing to be in a worse city to get a higher salary, etc.? Which of these is most important? And for Aya, it was salary. Again, she's got kids she wants to send to college. At this point in her career, at the age of 48, that was the most important thing for her. Second most important was not busting her butt to get that salary. And then city was in her top 3, but it was not as important. Even if we stopped here, there's already a little bit more clarity in just doing this first exercise, a little bit more clarity that we could apply to that pro-con list, but we can do better. The next question to ask is not just which is most important, but how important are they relative to each other? And to do that, one of the things that I do with my clients is basically give them importance points. So I gave Aya 20 importance points that she got to distribute across this 20 poker chips that she got to distribute across these big 3, city, salary, and work hours. Of the 20 importance points, Aya gave fully half of them to salary. She had 10 remaining. She gave 80% of the remaining 10 to work hours and only 2 to city. So now this gives us even more clarity, right? It's not just that salary is more important than city. It's that salary is 5 times more important than city. Work hours is 4 times more important than city. In fact, salary and work hours are here. City is in the top 3, but it's a little bit lower down. Okay, I'm going to put that aside for a second. I'm going to talk a little bit about something that decision scientists call the choice set. What are the options that you're actually choosing among? We already know the answer to this. Aya has 3. Job number 1, the part-time clinical job in New York. Job number 2, the CMO of a clinical startup in Tulsa. And then job 3, the full-time clinical role at a different hospital in Omaha. Step 5 is the deal breakers. Aya has already told us from the outset that she is unwilling to work a full-time clinical job. And if this is truly a deal breaker, now obviously we can go back and revisit that, but if this is truly a deal breaker, then there's no reason we should even be considering. We'll cross that one out of her choice set altogether. And at this point, that narrows her choice set down to 2. Job number 1 in New York, part-time. Job number 2, CMO, non-clinical of a startup in Tulsa. We're almost there. Step 6 is the kind of hardest to explain a little bit. It's the most mathy because in step 6, Aya has to make 6 different decisions. For each of her 2 jobs, job 1 and job 2, across each of the 3 important domains, city, salary, and work hours, she has to rank the job on a scale of 1 to 10 for that domain. So for example, salary at the New York City job was going to be pretty low because it's part-time and she lives in New York City, which is very expensive. She has 10 happiness points, for lack of a better word, to assign. So on a scale from 1 to 10, she gave salary at the New York City job only a 2 because it's pretty low. On the other hand, it's a part-time job. She'd have time to see her kids. She gave work hours a 7 out of 10, and she's been dying to live in New York City, so she ranked that one a 10 out of 10. If you follow what she's done here, then the next job is going to be fairly straightforward. It's kind of the opposite. The salary is really high at this clinical startup. The work hours are going to be busy. Startups are busy. She figured they would be less busy than the work that she's been doing so far as a full-time clinician. And again, I'm sorry to anybody from Oklahoma, but she really does not want to live in Tulsa. So she gave that one a 3 out of 10. I want to present the same data that I just presented to you, just a little bit more graphically so you can see everything on one screen. So I've got job 1 on the left in yellow, job 2 on the right in blue, the big 3, city, salary, and work hours represented for both of them. We know that she's assigned her importance weights for both of these. She gave 10 of her 20 poker chips to salary, 8 to work hours, and 2 to city. And now she has ranked each job on a scale of 1 to 10 across each of these 3 domains. So New York City gets a 10 out of 10, but the salary at that job was only a 2 out of 10. Tulsa only gets a 3 out of 10, but the salary at that job was a 9 out of 10, and so on. This is all the information that we need to take her pro con list that she made and actually solve that pro con list, solve for the right decision for her at this time. What we do next is just 2 math equations, a multiplication and an addition, to get the total number of weighted happiness points that each job would give Aya. We will weight her happiness points by how important that domain is. So we will multiply vertically 10 happiness points for city in job 1, weighted only 2 out of 20. 2 happiness points for salary in job 1, weighted 10 out of 20, and 7 weighted 8. So 10 times 2 should give us 20, 7 times 8 should give us 56, and so on. And then we just add them together. And if Aya has estimated all of her importances and her happiness correctly, then for the things that she is trying to solve for right now, she would get more happiness points from taking that clinical startup job in Tulsa than she would from taking the part-time clinical work in New York City, even though she's been dying to live in New York City for all of her life. Now, I'm going to end here in 2 slides. This framework should obviously, the way I've presented it should leave you with some questions. What if Aya is wrong? What if city is not 2, but 4? What if she's wrong about how much she likes New York or dislikes Tulsa? What if her happiness points are wrong? If she's going to make a change, does she pull the trigger? How does she involve other stakeholders in this decision? And then what if things change in the future? What if she takes the startup job and the company goes belly up? How does she handle the uncertainty of a big decision like that? We don't have time to get into that today. Happy to talk about it more in the Q&A session. But let me conclude here with these last sort of thoughts. Burnout itself is not a problem of resilience. And if anyone tells you, if you are burnt out and anyone tells you that you need to be more resilient, all they're doing is blaming the victim for a system that they are working in. You cannot yoga your way out of a system that no longer matches with the things that you want to do. Burnout is a complicated interplay of identity, of career trajectory, of an assumption that you will stay on the moving sidewalk. And those sorts of complicated multifactorial decisions require you to make decisions with clarity to structure your career in line with your why.